Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for convening this hearing. And of course, thanks to Secretary Buttigieg for joining us today. The IIJA was an important bill that funds our policy needs. As the chairman reminded us last week, as his portrait was being unveiled, the House passed a truly game-changing, transformative bill that we call the INVEST Act, establishing greenhouse gas emissions metrics, advancing a fix-it-first agenda, and massive investments in environmental justice initiatives, to name a few. Even though we weren't able to advance the INVEST Act or the Build Back Better Act, I am heartened that under your leadership, Mr. Secretary, the U.S. DOT has begun to implement parts of this progressive agenda under its existing authorities. Still, more must be done, and how we implement the IIJA is absolutely critical. For far too long, transportation policy has been disconnected from the broader social justice debate. Yet it determines access to jobs, clean air, clean water, affordable housing, and the fate of our climate. Mr. Secretary, I represent a working class immigrant community in Chicago and in the Cook County suburbs. And as you know, Chicago is a hub for rail, air, and truck transportation. Our communities deal with both the good and the bad of that. My neighborhood, Little Village, has some of the highest asthma and respiratory diseases in the country. And unfortunately, pollution from our transit corridors plays a big role in that. We have to be honest about the policies that led us here and deliberate about setting a new path. Mr. Secretary, approximately how much of IIJA money is going to expand highways and add lanes?
So I'd have to pull the exact funding, and of course, some of that will depend on how the states and project sponsors choose to allocate funding that can go either toward transit or highways in the formula case, and on the discretionary side could go toward projects that are more or less highway intensive. But what I'll say also is that this legislation gives us the means to look beyond the 1950s, 60s, or 70s mentality about transportation that often really subjected any mode other than single occupancy vehicles to the back burner. And when we do, as you wisely note, the benefit is not only in terms of more convenient, equitable, and decent ways to get around, but also the physical health of people who aren't subjected to as many emissions when we have more thoughtful and more wide-ranging options for people to get around, including active transportation and excellent public transit.
Excellent point. Mr. Secretary, the GHG performance measure is a great step, but what else is DOT doing to help ensure that the IIJA is part of the solution to emissions and climate change?
Well, certainly I would point to the Carbon Reduction Program, which provides dedicated funding for the purpose of making transportation investments that reduce the carbon intensity of the U.S. transportation sector. But that's far from the only set of resources that are going to make a big difference. Again, pretty much any investment that you make in transit is likely to reduce carbon emissions, but it's that much more so on investments like the low and no emission bus program, which helps local jurisdictions and transit authorities to acquire clean, efficient, electric or otherwise low emission buses for their routes, saving taxpayer money in the long run when they do so. We've got $7.5 billion for building out the electric charging infrastructure across the country, including, importantly, $2.5 billion, which is allowing us to make community charging investments, knowing that there are some places, often low-income places, where fuel savings might mean the most to a family if they could access an EV, but where it might not yet be profitable to install one. And so we think we can buy down that difference and stimulate access to EVs in multifamily dwellings, for example, in dense neighborhoods, just as we're building out that network across the U.S. on the longer stretches of highway. So just about every corner of our infrastructure policy holds the promise of helping us combat the climate challenge, and we're committed to making sure that we do everything that the law provides for us to do in that regard.
Absolutely. As you know, the transportation sector is one of the most unionized sectors in the country. Can you speak to how US DOT is going to put those principles into practice?
Yes, we know that it's vitally important to do so, and I think that what we really need to make sure of is to engage all of the players who have an opportunity to participate in the workforce of the future, because this is not just a question of fairness, although that's reason enough to ensure that we're bringing in people from backgrounds that have been excluded from these labor opportunities in the past, and supporting high-paying, good jobs with the opportunity to join a union. But it's also simply going to be necessary in order for us to get the work done, because this will require more of the American people and the American workforce than perhaps any national undertaking since World War II.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and Mr. Chair, you're back.